Just a reminder to get on our mailing list to make sure that you're getting up-to-date information about the class. And please, I'll make another appeal to participants who are joining us on live stream to try and make an effort to join us here in the sanctuary. We're down to 3 people here in the sanctuary, and it's much more fun the more people we have that we can interact with. And you'll have an opportunity to ask questions and really to follow along. I think it's a much more significant learning experience, just for those who are comfortable and for those who are able. This class is going to be recorded, so don't worry in case you needed to miss it. You will, or you had to miss it. It will be posted on the website, and that should happen by the end of the day. So we're going to pick up from source book today. Last class we finished reviewing the key verses in Exodus chapters 12 and 13 that introduced the Passover ritual, the biblical Passover ritual. And we took a look at many of the themes and rituals that are described in the Torah and tried to think a little bit ourselves where they may have found their way into the Seder that we know today. But now we're going to start using the Haggadah as our source book. So if you have a Haggadah at home, please bring it when you come to the class. But even if you don't, I think most of us are familiar generally, especially with the general themes of the Haggadah, and you don't even need it to follow along with the lecture. But as we go further along, I think the more you will need to have a Haggadah with you, just so you can know what I'm talking about. The Haggadah means the telling, and it is an extrapolation from one of the verses that we saw last week, Vehigadeta levincha bayom hahu. You should tell your child on that day. Haggadah, the telling. Now here's what's important to know. The biblical Seder we know about. The major ritual of the biblical Seder was the Passover sacrifice. Very good. And it makes sense why that would be the major ritual of the biblical Seder. Because I don't even want to use the word Seder because we haven't encountered that word yet. Seder. The reason why it makes sense that it would be the major ritual of the biblical Passover is because it's a mirror. It reflects what happened at the first Passover Seder. The first Passover Seder was when the blood of the lamb was put on the doorposts. God passed over the homes. It's a perfect match. So we know about the biblical Seder. We know about matzah. We know about maror. Those are mentioned in the Bible. And we know about the Seder that develops in the time of the Mishnah. The Seder that we observe today really has its roots in the period of the Mishnah, which is the 2nd century CE. What's important to know about that date is it's after the destruction of the temple. We don't know exactly, no matter how many theories you might review, we don't know exactly what happened between the two. That is, after the temple was destroyed and we could no longer have the Passover sacrifice, since the sacrifice had to be offered in the temple, we don't know how the Seder exactly developed, how it came to look like the way it looks today. What we do know is The Seder that was created in the time of the Mishnah and is described in the Mishnah looks an awful lot like contemporary Roman Greek meals of the day, and a particular Greek meal called the symposium. So much has been written about the similarity between the Passover Seder and the Roman symposium. A symposium was a meal where we know people ate reclined. Did the Bible mention anything about reclining? No. We also know that the Roman symposium had a lot of drinking and a lot of appetizers. We don't know of drinking or of appetizers in the biblical Seder. We also know that in the Roman symposium there was a lot of discussion and a meal that was a very lavish meal that was enjoyed after the discussion. And the discussion was almost the key climax of the evening. Not the meal. It was a discussion about philosophy. And that is very similar to the Seder that we know of today. The original biblical Passover, the meal was eaten early on, right? You had to finish that lamb. You had a set amount of time in which to do it. You couldn't be chit-chattering about the Exodus from Egypt. We don't know of any Haggadah. We don't know of any book that dates from the biblical period. And we don't know of any wine, and we don't know of any reclining. There's a debate as to whether the rabbis actually copied aspects of the symposium in creating the Passover Seder, but what I think is more correct is the rabbis saw the Seder as a elegant, lavish meal of free people. Right? That part of the Seder had to be an expression of freedom. And the way free people ate were in these symposia. So, since that was sort of the highest rung of fancy meal, they created the Passover Seder based on it. Right? There were, however, very important differences between the Roman Symposia and the Passover Seder, and we will get to those. I think one of the most important is that there are no records of any children participating in the Roman Symposium. None. There are no records of any poor people participating in the Roman Symposium. There's no records of any cheap bread at a Roman symposium. Something like that would be offensive, matzah. But the Jewish Seder didn't copy it. It sort of learned from it and added elements that the rabbis thought would be important. Right? Based on the biblical ideas that we read. Some of the themes that we read about, inclusion of everybody. Right? The symbolic foods. And the importance of children. Participating, actively participating. So we don't know exactly how one became the other. I wasn't around at the time. All we have are best guesses. For those who would like to learn more about that topic, there's a great book called The Origins of the Passover Seder by Boxer, I think his name was. And you can read more about the Roman similarities between the symposium and the Seder. The word Seder is biblical, even though it's not used to describe any ritual of the Passover offering in the Bible. That is, the verses we reviewed. We didn't see that word Seder. We saw Haggadah, but we didn't see Seder. We do know of a Seder, an order of bringing the Passover offering to the temple. There was an order to it. Remember, the blood had to be taken by the priests, and it was a complicated ritual. Certain parts of the animal were given to the people, but other parts the priests had to take for themselves. So there was an order to this whole ritual, and the Seder of bringing the Passover sacrifice then becomes transposed onto the Seder, the 15-step Seder of the Seder that we know. So the word exists, but it means something else. Let me say something about the word. Order, Seder. If this is a celebration of freedom, isn't it rather surprising that it is commemorated with a bunch of rules and orders? That is, freedom, if this is a festival of freedom, and by the way, I've had a problem with that from the beginning of this class. I've said, it's not a festival of freedom, it's a festival of gratitude. But it's definitely a theme in the evening. We start in bondage, we end in freedom. But don't you find it's a little silly that, okay, if it's a festival of freedom, let's just enjoy ourselves? Why should we have a bunch of rules to follow? You know, the first thing we do when we get around in the Seder is sing, if you know the song, of the 15 steps. Kadesh urchatz karpas yachatz magid rachza. It's sort of silly. The Festival of Freedom, we're chanting about all the rules we have to follow that night. Everything has to be done in the right order. This is, I think, one of the major themes that Pesach is trying to deal with, trying to discuss. When the Bible begins in the book of Genesis, things quickly go wrong. When there are no rules, people start taking advantage of each other. And by the time we get to Parshat Noach, the second Parsha in the Torah, what does it say about the state of the world? There's so much violence everywhere. V'timaleh haaretz Hamas. There's so much violence everywhere that God says, to hell with this. You guys, I made a mistake. We have to start all over again. Both in the beginning of the Torah, in the story of creation, and I think in the way these rules are meant to bind the Passover ritual, there is a statement about what freedom is and what freedom is not. Freedom is often misunderstood as I can do whatever I want. But that is a very selfish, individualistic view of freedom. We're not free to do anything unless everybody is free. Right? We're not free to participate in Pesach unless everybody at the table understands that they have rights and rules and protections. There's got to be some framework. By the same token, what happens at the end of Parshat Noach? There's so much order that the people get together and build a totalitarian society. This is the famous story of the Tower of Babel, where nobody the individual is also robbed of any existence because he or she has been manipulated to participate in whatever communal civilization building process there is. And that's also not freedom. Judaism begins the Seder with a very important statement about what freedom is. That freedom really can't exist unless there are rules. Think about it as a basketball game, as a simple example. If I put a bunch of people in a room and give them a ball and 2 nets and say, go have fun and let me know who wins, how is that supposed to work? In order to play the same game, everybody needs to understand the parameters, the rules, the boundaries. It's within a delineated, boundaried space that creativity and freedom really thrive. When we're singing the order of the Seder, when the rabbis decided to keep this idea, even though there's no more Passover offering and there's no more of that Seder, we're still going to keep that word Seder because it speaks so deeply to the kind of freedom that Judaism believes in. And that is one where the individual has rights and freedoms, but only to the extent that they protect the rights and freedoms of everyone else. And for that, we need boundaries. That's what the order of the Seder is, and the whole idea. We can't really have a game of basketball unless everybody knows the rules. You can't have a Seder unless everyone understands the rules we're playing. And I can make that, I can expand this in general to how Judaism approaches the world in general. With mitzvot, positive and negative mitzvot, boundaries. Not to rob the individual and turn him or her into a machine. It's against the rule of Judaism to serve God out of just like a machine, or like a servant in order to get his reward, the Mishnah says. That's not allowed. But to understand that my freedom impacts on the world, impacts on my community, impacts on others, and therefore ought to be navigated as a collective, is a really important statement. For a religion that's very concerned about peoplehood, and remember I said Passover is the central celebration of Jewish peoplehood. Well, we all have to have the same rules, or our Pesach will not survive either in time or in space. Right? It will look very different next generation than this generation, and it will look very different in Moscow than it does in New York. If we all play by the same rules, the Pesach is preserved. That's Seder. So let's begin with the order of the Seder. The first, I want to mention something else. Since it's the first song of the Seder, we didn't mention, and we should, even for just a moment, how important singing is in the Haggadah. You might think that you might not think so seriously about that topic, that theme, song. We take the 15 stages of the Seder and just compose something to it. But how much of the Haggadah is composed in prose, singable prose? It's a significant amount, particularly at the end. All the songs at the end, many of them don't even connect to Pesach, but they are tunes that we remember. Help me understand why that's important. That right from the beginning, we start to sing. Why is that important? Excellent. It's one of the ways that children remember things. We don't teach our kids A, B, C. We teach them A, B, C, D, E, F, G. By teaching them a tune, it makes it easier to remember. What we saw in the Bible, this is all about zikaron, memory. Singing is a great way to remember. Why else is song really important? Yes, it involves children. Community, right. When you sing, everyone can participate in the songs together. And remember that in the Bible, a very important idea of Pesach is sharing. You can't have Pesach alone. When you have a group of people together and everyone can sing the songs together, everyone's voice is included. There's something really important about singing together, right? That everybody's voice matters. What else? There's one more big one. You're singing that's excellent. That's excellent. So even though the story is a telling of the story, which one should do in whatever language, right? There's no rule, unlike, some other rituals that have to be done in Hebrew, like saying the Shema. You have to say the Shema in the Hebrew. You can't say it in English. But there's nothing in the Haggadah that says you have to, tell the story this way or read these passages from the Torah. You can explain to your child. In fact, you might be obligated to explain and answer questions to a child or anybody else at the table in the language that they will understand. But it's a lot easier to learn Hebrew and the songs that animate the Passover Seder when we put them to melody. For those who don't speak Hebrew, there are still many people I know who don't speak Hebrew, but they know Manishtana. That's the Hebrew they know. So yes, it's a great act of national identity. Song helps me connect to Hebrew. Excellent. I would add that singing is really important in the story of the redemption from Egypt, the historical redemption from Egypt. Because at first, it's God. How does God hear the people? How does God hear the Israelites? He hears their tza'akatam, their screams and their shouts. That's how God, I'm not going to address the big question of why God allowed slavery to happen in the first place. But God hears their shouting, the Israelites shouting, and the redemption. Where's their song in the redemption? At the sea, right? The song at the sea is a huge feature. We don't maybe appreciate how important it is. But the Bible emphasizes everybody sang together. Ashira Lashem ki ga'o ga'a. Let us sing to God who has redeemed us wondrously. Well, if If the Seder is about gratitude, and at the sea our ancestors expressed that gratitude through song, what would a Seder be like without any song? It wouldn't make sense. If the whole purpose is to connect us back to the original story, there must be song. So for all of these reasons, right, even though there doesn't say anything in the Bible about singing, it's sort of obvious that the Seder had to develop with song. Songs, even when you're going through the orders of the Seder, which is not all that interesting, you should still put it to song. It will help people to remember. And the idea of memory, repeated over and over and over in the Bible, is the major animating theme of the Seder. Okay, so we covered the steps of the Seder. We covered song. Now let's talk about step number 1, Kadesh. Now, that's not so surprising that we say a Kiddush at the eve of a holiday. We always say Kiddush on the eve of the holiday. But I want to use the opportunity to talk about the cups of wine, since Kiddush is recited over the 4 cups of wine, and we have not encountered the cups of wine yet. Remember, I said it was an important aspect of the Roman symposium, but there's no wine in the Passover Haggadah. So, some ideas. Why is wine part of the Passover Seder? Why do you think? In the symposium, we know that rich people drank wine. So, since this is a meal for rich people, we drink wine too. But there's more. That's not a good explanation. Maybe that's historically accurate, but we have to give meaning to some of these rituals. And throughout our journey through the Haggadah, I'm going to just shout out some ideas that work for me. But the beautiful thing about the Seder is that there's so many Haggadot and so many different explanations of the ritual of the Haggadah. There can sometimes just be hundreds of different explanations for why we do one thing or another, and they're all valid. I said when we reviewed the sources in the Bible, one of the beautiful things about the way the Seder is presented, the way the Passover sacrifice, the Passover rituals are presented, is that the Torah doesn't say exactly why you do everything. It says you eat the matzah, you eat the maror, you eat the Passover sacrifice, but why is left for us to figure out. Now, left for us to talk about. Okay, so since we have to talk about it, wine. Why wine? Marlene, you wanted to say something? So you can't help but see the strong connection between blood and wine. The Christians also, right? But the Jews did something else with the wine. They said, well, this blood is the Passover sacrifice. We never said that. At no point, I'm not familiar with any text that says that the wine we drink is symbolic of the blood of the Passover sacrifice. But what is the wine symbolic of? Particularly the 4 cups. Wine in Judaism is always a symbol for joy. When we are happy, when there's a reason to celebrate, there's wine. Because wine calms us down, makes us happy, makes us joyful. 4 cups of wine, and I think the wine back then was much more diluted than the wine we know of today, is also really important to talk about. Why 4 cups of wine? 4 is a really important number in the natural world. We talk about the 4 seasons, the 4 directions. In physics, I'm talking about before the complicated table of the elements. You basically had 4 elements, right? Earth, water, fire. I'm forgetting one. Wind, earth, water, air, and fire. The 4 elements, right? Remember that this is a New Year's celebration. A New Year's celebration has to have alcohol and should be celebrating time and space and the elements of the world. It's a time of renewal for all of humanity. That's one explanation for why 4 glasses of wine. But I have some more. What's the classic one? Why 4 cups of wine? The classic explanation for why we have 4 cups of wine. Right. So in Exodus chapter 6, God says to Moses, I will redeem your people. I will bring them out. I will save them. And I will take them. Since there are 4 different verbs that describe redemption, it's as if we're toasting to each one having been fulfilled. This is a classic explanation, and there's actually a really important piece to it that I also want to mention. There's actually a 5th word. This is the origin of the cup of Elijah, right? In Exodus chapter 6, it also says, I will bring them to my land, to the promised land. There's a 5th verb. There's a debate in the Talmud about whether that verb is related to redemption, or is that something that happens after redemption? That is redemption complete after we cross the sea, or is redemption complete only when we come to our own land? And there was a debate in the Talmud about whether that's the case or not. So where is the 5th cup on the table? It's the cup of Elijah. Why do we call it the cup of Elijah? Not because, as many think, Elijah's going to come in and drink it, but because in the Talmud, issue cannot be resolved. Often, the rabbis will say, let Elijah come and solve the problem. An unanswered question. That's what that 5th cup represents. To me, that is a very powerful and important idea that is being highlighted right as we get to the tables when the glass of wine for Elijah is seen. There is something about confronting and accepting our finiteness, our limited knowledge, our inability to answer every question that supports human freedom. When somebody comes along like Pharaoh, who believes he has the answer for every question, the human mind becomes small. The cup of Elijah might be the most important symbol at the Seder table in the world we live in today, where everybody knows the answer to everything. where we really struggle at this idea of believing in anything for which there is not proven facts. But the presence of the fifth cup is there to say, there's some things we'll never know, and we're okay with that. That's just the world in which we live. A world of unanswered questions. And it's the very fact that there are questions to which we have no answers that helps safeguard our freedom, because it keeps our minds active and alert and awake in constant debate and search for truth. And that's what a Seder is. Talking to each other, listening to each other, trying to find the truth. It can't exist if the questions are answered. There are other explanations for the 4 cups of wine. One that I want to mention is coming up in Shul just in a few weeks. In the story of Joseph and his journey down to Egypt, he winds up in jail where he meets who? A baker and a butler, Pharaoh's cupbearer. If you read that passage where Pharaoh's cupbearer is describing his dreams, the word cup, kos, appears 4 times. 4 times. Why is that important or interesting? What happens to cupbearer? Anyone know the story? Does the cupbearer get killed or the cupbearer is set free? Who remembers? That's right. The cupbearer is set free. It's the baker who's done. So the Midrash, that is rabbinic interpretation, believes that perhaps the cupbearer was not just talking about himself and his own fate. Remember what Joseph says to him. Joseph says, I understand your dream. After, I think, 3 years or something, you will go free. But rabbinic interpretation says that the cupbearer's dream was also symbolic for the Jewish people. That the cupbearer, this wine is a symbol for freedom, going back to this story. There's an aspect of wine that brings out redemption. How so? The Talmud says, when wine comes in, emet comes out. Emet is truth. Nichnas yayin yotze emes. Let wine come in, let the truth come out. Wine takes away human inhibition. Sometimes. And for a person to truly be free, they have to be comfortable with who they are and know who they are and not feel restrained, which is a different kind of slavery. Wine allows you to be who you are. Now, how is that different than a baker? Remember, we don't like bakers. Why don't we like bakers? Because the pastries and the cakes all go rotten. That's why you're not allowed. It's so interesting, eh? Like wine takes center stage. We want the stream of the cupbearer. We don't want the baker. We don't want any of his stuff around in our homes. No chametz. And in Joseph's story, it's the cupbearer who is redeemed, but the baker who is not. So we sort of take his story and say there is something about wine that leads to freedom. Even Joseph saw it. And since it's mentioned 4 times, the word kos, we we have 4 cups. Don't ask me where that leaves the cup of Elijah. But there's different, as I said, these are all different ideas that I'm throwing at you, and maybe one will resonate. And finally, the idea that I'll suggest about the 4 cups of wine. In the book of Genesis, when God engages in a covenant with Abraham, the Brit Ben Bitarim, the covenant of the pieces, God says, your children will be enslaved in Egypt. They'll go down to Egypt and they will remain there how many years? 400 years. And which generation will return back? The 4th. Dor Revi'i Yashuvu Henna, the Bible says. As I'm explaining all of these number 4 significance, you should not only read this is important to the number of cups of wine that we drink. The number 4 appears many times in the Seder. The 4 questions, the 4 sons. 4 is the theme. That's the important number of the Passover Seder. To me, I like this one. I like that explanation. That since God tells Abraham the 4th generation will return, we drink the 4 cups of wine to celebrate that sometimes freedom takes time. Liberation takes time, even generations, until you finally get there. So those are the best ideas I think are out there that explain how wine was introduced at the Seder. It is a drink that conveys luxury and relaxation. The word symposium in Roman, I believe the last syllable, or the second half of the word, posium, means wine. So there had to be wine if that's what we were modeling the Seder after. Its connection to blood, which is subtle but not mentioned for obvious reasons. And also that it's drunk because of the story of Joseph and how wine brings out truth. And if you want to have real discussion and real debate, you have to be able to speak what you really believe. Any other ideas for wine that you may have shared yourselves? Yes? At the Seder, there's a special rule that you have to use red wine because of that subtle memory of the blood, right? Even though it's subtle, it's still important. Any other ideas? Okay, so that's Kadesh. Now Urchatz. In the time of the Mishnah, whenever you were eating moist vegetables, you had to wash your hands. It was a sanitary thing. This is what they understood. That moist vegetables would sort of, if your hands were dirty, then it would absorb some of the dirt and then the food you eat would not be healthy. But I don't like that explanation. You'll read that in some Haggadah. Here's why I think Urchatz is really important. Urchatz is about purity. There's no bracha. When you wash your hands after you say Kiddush, first of all, not everybody does it. Sometimes it's just the leader who does it of the Seder. But it is a statement to everybody of purity. When the Passover offering was offered in Jerusalem, you had to be in a state of purity in order to offer it, right? We read about that. In fact, If you were not, that's the whole idea of Pesach Sheni. A month later, on the Jewish calendar, still today, if you have a Hebrew calendar, it'll say a month after Passover, Pesach Sheni. Well, what's the whole origin of Pesach Sheni? The Bible says, if you weren't pure when on the 15th day of Nisan or the 14th day of Nisan, you could come back a month later. Why would someone be impure? How do you get impure in the Bible? It's mostly because of contact with the dead. You couldn't just magically go to the mikvah and have the impurity wash away. There was a period of waiting that had to be observed, so not everybody could fulfill the Passover on the day it was supposed to be fulfilled. If you were in the time of the Bible, you had to wait a whole month. But at our Seders today, we still have this ritual in order to affirm that what this is, what this meal is, this is not dinner. There is something sacred. There is a ritual that we are about to perform. And just as in the time of the Bible, it had to be performed in purity, so too do we call upon that memory in our observance of Pesach today. Yes, it's just my hands, right? But the hands are the most important part of the Passover ritual. Everything, you need your hands in order to eat. This is an eating festival. And I make sure that they are pure, not because I'm going to eat something, but because they symbolize how we should be coming into Pesach. A New Year's festival requires the belief that it is possible to begin again. We know that from Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. And in fact, there's a custom to go to the mikveh also before Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Water is what? Purifies. Like in the mikveh. Water purifies. It is the tool we use to be reborn, to start again. Isn't that really important that we have some ritual like that at the Seder table? So that to me is what's really important about Urchatz. Everyone has a chance to start again. What's after Urchatz? Karpas. Karpas also has no origin in the Bible. It doesn't say anywhere in the Bible to eat celery or to have any appetizer. But it was an important feature of the Roman Symposium. Karpas, here's what I'd say about Karpas. To me, the most important thing about Karpas is dipping. Okay, Marlene, you were here on Saturday night. We talked about dipping because of the Parsha this week. The Passover journey, slavery in Egypt, begins with dipping and ends with dipping. Marlene, help us understand, since you were here on Saturday night. And you don't remember? Come on. Does someone know what I'm talking about? What is the dipping that began the Passover story? Slavery in Egypt. No, that's what ends the Passover story. What's the one from this week's Parsha? The brothers take Joseph's coat and dip it in blood and show their father and say, Chaya ra'a achalatu, a terrible animal has eaten him. Sinat chinam, brotherly hatred, baseless hatred between brothers begins the Passover story. And how does the Passover story end? Marlene said, you all know this because we read about it. The dipping of the hyssop into the blood, another dipping, and painted on the doorposts. Shebechol haleilot ein anu matbilim afilu pam echad, halayla hazeh shtei pe'amim. At the Passover Seder, there are 2 dippings. When's the second one, by the way? This is the first, with the karpas into the salt water. Right? And karpas, which is sweet, into the salt water, which is salty, gives a little bit of a taste of bitterness. But what's the second dipping? The maror into the charoset. That's right before the meal. You take the maror and dip it into the charoset, and that's the second dipping of the Seder, already the dipping of liberation. But we haven't even begun to tell the story yet, and we bring up another crucial idea of liberation, of freedom, which is you can't be free if your heart is full of hate. And we wouldn't be in this mess anyway. We wouldn't have to observe this anyway if only there was no hate. So think about, we haven't even really started yet, and how many big themes the Passover Seder has introduced. That's why when people say we don't know what to talk about or we just tell a story, I mean, give me a break. Freedom versus order. Right? When we talked about wine, what does it mean? The truth. To be true to yourself. Having unanswered questions in the world, not knowing the answers to everything. And many more. All the way up to this hatred, which led to the Exodus, or which led to slavery in the first place. And now we bring attention to that at the karpas part of the Seder. Okay, you're with me? We have time to do maybe 1 or 2 more. What's after karpas? Karpas yachatz. Okay? No big deal. We just break the middle matzah. Okay, first of all, why do we have 3 pieces of matzah anyway? We should have 2 at all holiday and Shabbat meals. There are 2 loaves of bread. Why do we have 3? Well, there's a special commandment on Pesach to eat the Passover matzah. So, the top and the bottom matzah represent the matzot that we normally will eat at any holiday meal or Shabbat meal, regular loaves of bread. But the middle loaf in between is the Pesach, the extra loaf for Pesach. I know it's a piece, but think about it as a big loaf. That's the extra one for Pesach. Why do we break it? Well, that is the Pesach loaf, the very important one. We break it in half, keep 1/2 of it, and give one to a child who will hide it away as the afikomen. So some will say that the reason we break the middle matzah is because we no longer have a Passover sacrifice. So we take the matzah and break it into 2 pieces. One representing the matzah that you have to eat on Pesach, and the other half representing the Passover sacrifice. And the afikomen is the Passover sacrifice. We're breaking it into 2 since the matzah now has to take on, in a post-temple world, the added responsibility of also being our Passover sacrifice. That's one reason. Another, when we break the middle piece of bread, the first thing we say, the middle piece of matzah, the first thing we say is, Ha lachma anya. This is the bread of poverty. Remember I said, the Bible doesn't really explain why we eat matzah. It gives hints, but never lays it out clearly. That means matzah can take on different symbols. It can be different things. It can be both the bread of oppression and the bread of freedom. At the beginning of the Seder, it is certainly described as a bread of oppression. Lechem oni, the bread of poverty. And a poor person will often not finish her meal. Why? Because you don't know where your next meal is coming from. And so you just break it. You keep some for later while you enjoy some of it now. Many Passover Haggadahs will explain that as the reason for why we break the middle matzah. We're eating it like a poor person, which means hiding part of it away for our next meal. Some will say that it's because of these two meanings of the matzah that we break it in half. Since matzah is both the bread of slavery and the bread of oppression, we break it in half to say half of it will be eaten now as a symbol of oppression, and half of it will be eaten later as a symbol of freedom. Right? Literally breaking it to show there's two components to this bread. All of these are nice, but it's not my favorite. Here's my favorite explanation for why we eat, why we have to break the matzah before the Seder begins. This is a New Year's celebration. The purpose of a New Year's celebration is to evaluate our lives, to see where we ought to improve. No different than what you know from years of attending services on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, which is the more well-known New Year's celebration, the more obvious New Year's celebration. But Pesach, biblically, is the more important New Year's celebration. If our job at a New Year's celebration is to improve and think about our lives, well, you can't do that if everything's perfect. If you come to the Seder table and everything is whole, you have answers to all of your questions, you don't need to improve in any aspect of your life, well, then what are you doing at the table? What does this holiday have to offer you? I believe that the bread is broken in order to convey ritually to everyone at the table that we are all just half of a loaf. Right? That it's our task in life to constantly be working towards wholeness. But we're never going to get there. We know what direction to go in, but we need everybody at the beginning of the Seder to be hungry. Not just for food, that's a given in my Seder, but hungry for growth, hungry to learn, hungry to be challenged, hungry to be engaged. That's why the first thing we say after we break that loaf is Kol dichfin yete v'yichol kol ditzrich yete v'yitzach. You're inviting, in those words, halach ma'anya, you can look them up if you brought your Haggadah. We're inviting two people to come and eat. Who? Kol dichfin. Everyone who is hungry, come and eat. But then we say kol ditzri, and everyone who is in need. Those are not the same. Our meal is not just here to satisfy our hunger. That's not what the Pesach Seder is about. It's there because we all are invited to this Seder in need. Your need will be different than mine, because this year has presented challenges to you that are different than the ones they've presented to me. But we both don't have a full loaf. And if this Seder is going to work, if we believe that the purpose of a Seder is not just to remember the past, but to apply that past and its lesson to our present circumstances, which I would argue is an idea that originates in the Bible. We saw it. Ba'avur zeh asa Hashem li, we read last week. As you're pointing to the matzah and maror, God did this for me, not for my ancestors, for me. So in every generation, one has to apply the lessons of the Exodus to herself. That means I have to come to the Seder ready to do so. And that is the person we're inviting. Some people think halach ma'anya is so stupid because they say, why are you inviting people to Seder? You're already sitting down. You send out an invitation weeks in advance. You don't send out an invitation while you're sitting down to eat. And you can't just say it at a table. You have to go outside and scream it from the rooftops, or mail out a letter, or make a phone call. But that's what we don't get, that I think when we fail to appreciate about halach ma'anya, that's so important. You're not inviting others. You have to do that too. But that's not what halach ma'anya is. You invite others weeks before. Halach ma'anya, you're inviting yourself. You're speaking to everybody at the table. If you're here and your loaf of bread is already complete and you don't feel like you need anything, you're not going to get much out of this. But if we're really going to treat this as a New Year's celebration and look for this as an opportunity to apply the central lesson of Jewish identity to our lives today, you must feel you're needy. A physical hunger, but a spiritual hunger is even more important because it is from there that we will grow. With me? That's Yachatz and Halach Ma'anya. I just want to say another thing about Halach Ma'anya, that some people say that Anya is related to the word la'anot, to answer. So some will say halach ma'anya means the bread upon which answers are offered. I don't like that as much. But some people will say that. One other thing, the act of sharing. Remember we saw that in the Bible? You have to eat that lamb by a certain hour means you have to have enough people around the table. It's impossible to observe the Passover alone. So how appropriate that one of the first things we do when the Seder begins is speak to our guests. Remind ourselves that we're not alone in this. Kol dichvin yetevichu. Let all who are hungry come and eat. It's an invitation, even though I said it's a silly invitation, because you're already sitting down to dinner. It still reminds us that free people share. Sharing is an act of freedom. How does halach ma'anya continue? Let all who are hungry come and eat. Let all who are in need come and be satisfied. It then says, Hashtahaka Lashana Haba Be'ar'ad Yisrael. Now we're here. Next year, let us be in the land of Israel. Isn't that interesting? Right in the Bible, we saw that the destination is really important. God says not just where I'm taking you out of, but also where I am bringing you. So in the plural, we say to each other, this year we're here. Where could that be? Well, it's wherever you are. This is a line you should imagine when you're saying it, Jews reciting this all over the world. Now we're here, but soon we will be in the land of Israel. The land of Israel here is not the land of Israel that will be a safe harbor for the Jews. It's not Herzl's land of Israel. What is Ar'ad Yisrael that's being referred to here? A homeland, a spiritual homeland. For most of Jewish history, until 74, 3 years ago, these words were words that came from a place of exile. I don't just mean that in a physical way. It's obvious that those who recited these words were in exile. But imagine them being recited by people who felt themselves to be oppressed. Let all who are needy, let all who are hungry, including us, who are also subjugated, who also are not free. Right? And don't think that we can't say that even in a place like Canada or in America. There are many, many different facets of contemporary life that you might call oppressive or enslave us in different ways. So the dream of being in the land of Israel is the dream of independence, peoplehood. This is the bread of oppression that our ancestors ate. Meaning with this statement, we connect ourselves to Jewish people all over the world because we all have the same ancestors. And we all have the same destination. Hashtahacha, now we are wherever we are, but one day we will be in our homeland. And then, Hashta Avdei. So if you didn't believe me before when I said, imagine these words being recited by a people in exile, I think this last verse makes it clear. Now we are slaves. L'shana haba'ah b'nei chorim. But let's look forward to being free. Exile is oppression. Israel is freedom. You with me? So the idea of there being a destination, which is really important in the Bible, is affirmed almost as soon as the Seder begins. It is a vision of peoplehood, of common destiny that's being affirmed. And this part of the Haggadah invites all of us to consider, how are we Avdei still today? The important concept is laid out here in black and white, that we are not just here to tell a story about the past, we're here to reflect on our current circumstances. We are still hungry. We are still in need. We are still enslaved. We are still in exile. So, I've said it 100 times, but I'll just say it again. People have to understand when they're celebrating Pesach, we're taking the lessons of the past and trying to apply them to our present circumstances. That's why the story has to be told year after year, because our present circumstances are changing all the time. And it doesn't matter how knowledgeable you are. Nobody has seen the world tomorrow yet. And nobody will know how to take the lessons of the past and apply them to tomorrow yet. That's how this holiday stays eternal. If it was just about remembering, it would have died out long ago. It's not about remembering. It's about applying. Take what you remember and think about how to live your life better today, given that we are still enslaved, and it's a question of what we're enslaved to. What are we enslaved to? Our time is enslaved, our minds, so many different subjects to think about. So I think we'll stop there. Right? And obviously now, does the broken matzah make sense? Right? If halach ma'anya is all about we're still enslaved, we're still in exile, I'm as a person not who I want to be fully. Well, of course, it's recited over brokenness. That's the brokenness that's being invited to the table. Not anybody else, you. We want your broken self. If you think you're whole, the Seder isn't going to have much to offer. Okay, so there's Halach Ma'anya. We'll stop there and pick up with Manishtana next week. Questions, thoughts, comments? But how is that different than other holidays? That's the question. But there's a formal structure to other holidays too. I have a different idea. I have a different but related idea. Question is, how did Passover really survive? And how has it remained relevant? The observance of Sukkot today is unrecognizable compared to what it was in the time of the temple. It's not just unrecognizable, it's almost, God don't strike me down, and it's almost meaningless. What is Sukkot? Sukkot is a harvest holiday. It's about praying for rain. We're dancing around with the four species, and we don't even know what they are and what they mean. Our lives are so separated from the reality of the agricultural world and the temple gathering that would have been just wonderful if we had lived at that time. Its focus on the temple made it very difficult to perpetuate once the temple was destroyed. The brilliance of Pesach, and I don't know if it was purposeful or not, I'm not God, but let's assume it was. The brilliance of Pesach is that it was always focused on the home. On the home. And therefore could follow us wherever we went. right? It originated in Egypt. It originated in exile. So for 2,000 years, when we're in exile, the holiday is perfect. It speaks very much to our experience. Longing to be free. So that's where I think its power has lasted, why it's such an effective holiday at conveying and sustaining the important lessons of Judaism. Right? It's just easy to transport. Other thoughts, ideas? And not just that, Merle, but what you said is true too, which is the family unit, right? Is the most powerful vehicle we have to transmit stories through time. That's how stories survive, when they're told within family units and shared across generations. But you're proving my point. You're proving my point, right? Because the ritual happened in the comfort of your home, with over time within a family, and you remember it throughout your life, and it's taken on different forms and meanings and throughout your life, it lasts. It's not as easy to say that about Sukkot or Shavuot. Right? But that's okay. Doesn't have to work every single time. But my job is a lot harder on Sukkot than it is on Pesach, right? In Israel, Sukkot has a different meaning. Yes. Yeah. But still, I would argue, nothing like it would have had in the original Sukkot of the temple. Right? You're getting a little taste of it. People coming to Israel and school being out and it being a wonderful festival. That's nice. But still, it was not the big, big party that they had. Thousands and thousands of people packed into the temple, circling around the altar. We don't know from that. So, because we don't have the temple anymore, but we never needed a temple for Pesach. It enhanced it, but it wasn't necessary. All right. Next week, Manishtanah.